On July 30th, 1975, one of America's most powerful and controversial figures walked out of his suburban Detroit home and vanished without a trace. James Jimmy Hoffa, the notorious president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, America's largest and most influential labor union, was last seen waiting in a restaurant parking lot in Bloomfield Township, Michigan. This wasn't just any union leader. Hoffa controlled the livelihoods of over 2 million truck drivers, warehouse workers, and transportation employees across the United States. He commanded billions of dollars in pension funds, had the power to shut down the nation's commerce with a single phone call, and maintained dangerous relationships with some of the most feared figures in organized crime. Hoffa's disappearance occurred at the height of 1970s America, when the line between legitimate business and organized crime was often blurred, especially in the labor movement. The Teamsters Union had become a shadow empire, officially representing workers' rights, but unofficially serving as a financial pipeline for the mafia's most ambitious ventures. What makes this case extraordinary isn't just the disappearance itself, but the obsessive, decades-long investigation that followed. The FBI would spend more time, money, and resources searching for Jimmy Hoffa than almost any other single case in American history. Hundreds of agents, thousands of interviews, dozens of excavations, and countless false leads would consume the Bureau for nearly half a century. The case became a national obsession, spawning countless theories, confessions, books, movies, and documentaries. Everyone from mafia informants to deathbed confessors claimed to know where Jimmy Hoffa was buried. Yet despite all the investigations, all the technology, and all the resources thrown at this mystery, one question has remained unanswered for nearly 50 years. What happened to Jimmy Hoffa? James Hoffa was born on February 14, 1913, in Brazil, Indiana, to German immigrant parents who struggled to make ends meet during America's industrial boom. When Jimmy was just 7 years old, his father died from lung disease, likely caused by years of working in hazardous conditions. This early tragedy would shape Hoffa's worldview and fuel his lifelong fight for workers' rights. The family moved to Detroit during the Great Depression, where young Jimmy witnessed firsthand the brutal exploitation of American workers. At just 14 years old, he dropped out of school to help support his family, taking a job at a grocery store for 32 cents an hour. It was there that Jimmy Hoffa discovered he had a natural talent for organizing people and standing up to authority. His entry into the labor movement came in 1932, when he was just 18 years old. Working as a warehouse loader for Kroger, Hoffa organized his fellow workers to demand better wages and working conditions. His first strike was a masterpiece of strategy. He waited until a shipment of fresh strawberries arrived, knowing the company would lose thousands if the fruit spoiled. Within days, Kroger capitulated to the workers' demands. This early victory caught the attention of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, and by 1935, Hoffa had become a full-time union organizer. He was different from other labor leaders. He was tough, street-smart, and willing to use any means necessary to protect his members. In an era when companies hired violent strikebreakers, Hoffa fought fire with fire. Hoffa's rise through the Teamsters hierarchy was meteoric. He understood that in the world of organized labor, power came from unity and fear in equal measure. By the 1940s, he controlled Teamsters Local 299 in Detroit, and by the 1950s, he had expanded his influence across the Midwest. In 1957, Jimmy Hoffa achieved his ultimate goal. He was elected president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, making him the leader of the most powerful labor union in America. At the height of his power, Hoffa controlled not just the trucking industry, but the flow of goods across the entire nation. If the Teamsters went on strike, America's economy could grind to a halt. But with great power came dangerous alliances. To build his empire, Hoffa had made deals with organized crime figures who could provide muscle when negotiations failed. These relationships would eventually become his greatest strength, and ultimately his downfall. By the 1960s, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters had become far more than just a labor union. It was a financial empire that controlled the economic heartbeat of America. Under Jimmy Hoffa's leadership, the Teamsters represented over 2 million members across virtually every aspect of the transportation and logistics industry: truck drivers, warehouse workers, airline mechanics, and freight handlers. But the real power of the Teamsters lay not in their membership numbers, but in their pension fund. The Central States Pension Fund had grown into a multi-billion-dollar financial institution, one of the largest pools of investment capital in the United States. This massive fund was supposed to secure retirement benefits for hardworking Teamsters members. But under Hoffa's control, it became something entirely different: a private bank for organized crime. The pension fund's loan practices were nothing short of extraordinary. While legitimate banks required extensive paperwork, collateral, and credit checks, the Teamsters Pension Fund operated by different rules. If you had the right connections and were willing to pay the right people, you could secure millions in loans with minimal oversight. This system fueled the explosive growth of Las Vegas during the 1960s, as casino after casino was built with Teamsters pension money. Hoffa's methods for maintaining control were as controversial as they were effective. When companies refused to recognize Teamsters representation, they might find their delivery trucks mysteriously breaking down, their warehouses experiencing accidents, or their non-union drivers facing intimidation. Hoffa didn't just negotiate contracts. He enforced them through a network of loyal enforcers who understood that sometimes violence was the only language that corporate executives understood. The federal government had been watching this growing empire with increasing alarm. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, brother of President John F. Kennedy, made destroying Hoffa's power his personal crusade. Kennedy formed the Get Hoffa Squad, a team of federal prosecutors and FBI agents whose sole mission was to find evidence that would put the Teamsters leader behind bars. The cat-and-mouse game between Hoffa and the Kennedy administration became legendary. Congressional hearings revealed the depths of corruption within the Teamsters, but Hoffa seemed untouchable, using his political connections and legal loopholes to evade conviction after conviction. Finally, in 1964, federal prosecutors found their smoking gun. Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering and misuse of union funds. After years of appeals, he was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison. In March 1967, Jimmy Hoffa, the man who had built America's most powerful labor empire, walked through the gates of Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. But even from behind bars, Hoffa refused to give up control of his empire. He continued to issue orders, make decisions, and plot his return to power, setting the stage for the deadly conflicts that would ultimately lead to his disappearance. On December 23, 1971, Jimmy Hoffa walked out of Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary a changed man, but his ambition burned as fierce as ever. President Richard Nixon had commuted his sentence, but the freedom came with a devastating catch. Hoffa was banned from all union activities until 1980. For a man whose entire identity was built around power and control, this restriction was worse than imprisonment. The condition of his release was no accident. Nixon's commutation deal had been carefully orchestrated to keep Hoffa away from the Teamsters while appearing to grant him mercy. The president understood that releasing Hoffa without restrictions would create political chaos, but he also needed Teamsters support for the upcoming 1972 election. The compromise seemed perfect, except that nobody had consulted Jimmy Hoffa about spending 9 years in political exile. During Hoffa's imprisonment, the Teamsters empire had not stood still. Frank Fitzsimmons, Hoffa's hand-picked successor, had assumed control of the union and discovered that he enjoyed being more than just a caretaker. Fitzsimmons had forged his own relationships with organized crime figures and had no intention of stepping aside when his former mentor returned. The union that Hoffa had built was now under the control of a man he increasingly viewed as a betrayer. But the most dangerous change during Hoffa's incarceration involved the mafia families that had profited so handsomely from Teamsters pension fund loans. Under Hoffa's leadership, these relationships had been carefully managed through personal loyalty and mutual benefit. Hoffa knew where the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. and the crime families respected his discretion and business acumen. Fitzsimmons, however, operated differently. He was more pliable, easier to manipulate, and asked fewer questions about how the pension fund money was being used. The Mafia had grown comfortable with their new arrangement and viewed Hoffa's potential return as a threat to their expanded influence. They had invested billions in Las Vegas casinos, funded countless criminal enterprises, and established new revenue streams that they weren't willing to give up. From 1972 to 1975, Hoffa became increasingly desperate and reckless in his attempts to regain control. He filed lawsuit after lawsuit challenging the restrictions of his release, arguing that Nixon had exceeded his constitutional authority. He gave inflammatory interviews to reporters, hinting at explosive revelations about government corruption and organized crime connections. Most dangerously, he began reaching out to old contacts in the Mafia, trying to rebuild alliances and gather support for his comeback. The pressure was immense and came from all directions. Federal agents maintained constant surveillance, documenting his every move and contact. Union officials who had once jumped at his commands now avoided his phone calls. Former allies in organized crime sent subtle but unmistakable messages that his services were no longer required. Hoffa's family watched with growing concern as the man they loved became increasingly paranoid and isolated. His wife Josephine begged him to retire quietly, to enjoy his grandchildren and leave the Union battles to younger men. But Jimmy Hoffa had never backed down from a fight in his life, and he wasn't about to start at age 62. By the summer of 1975, Hoffa believed he'd found a path back to power. He had been in secret negotiations with Anthony "Tony Jack" Giacalone, a powerful Detroit Mafia captain, and Anthony "Tony Pro" Provenzano, a former Teamsters leader from New Jersey who had his own connections to organized crime. Both men claimed they could help broker a deal that would restore Hoffa's union leadership in exchange for certain concessions about how the pension fund would be managed. These negotiations were incredibly risky. Giacalone and Provenzano were not Hoffa's friends. They were calculating criminals who had prospered during his absence and had their own reasons for wanting to control the conversation about his future. But Hoffa was running out of options and time. The 1980 deadline for his eligibility to return to union activities was still 5 years away, and he feared that by then, his empire would be completely beyond his reach. On the morning of July 30th, 1975, everything seemed to be falling into place. Hoffa had arranged to meet with Giacalone and Provenzano at the Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, an upscale establishment known for its discretion and businessmen's lunches. The meeting was supposed to finalize the terms of his return to power and resolve the conflicts that had been building for years. Hoffa was optimistic as he prepared to leave his home that morning. He told his wife he would be back for dinner and that this meeting might finally solve all their problems. He had no idea that he was walking into a trap that had been months in the making, orchestrated by the very people he believed were going to restore his empire. July 30th, 1975, started as an ordinary summer day in Detroit. The temperature was climbing toward 85 degrees, and Jimmy Hoffa was in remarkably good spirits as he prepared for what he believed would be the most important business meeting of his comeback campaign. At 62 years old, he still maintained the physical presence that had intimidated corporate executives and union rivals for decades. Stocky, powerful, with piercing eyes that seemed to look right through anyone who opposed him. Hoffa had spent the morning reviewing his strategy for the afternoon meeting. He knew that Anthony Giacalone and Anthony Provenzano were dangerous men who commanded respect in both legitimate business circles and the criminal underworld. But Hoffa had dealt with such men his entire career. He understood the language of power, intimidation, and mutual benefit that governed these relationships. At exactly 1 p.m., Hoffa kissed his wife Josephine goodbye and walked out of their modest home on Square Lake Road in Lake Orion, Michigan. He was dressed conservatively in a dark business suit, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had controlled billions of dollars and commanded the loyalty of millions of workers. His destination was the Red Fox restaurant, an upscale establishment about 20 miles away in Bloomfield Township. The Red Fox was the perfect venue for a clandestine business meeting. Located in an affluent suburb, it catered to executives, lawyers, and businessmen who valued privacy and discretion. The restaurant's maitre d' was known for seating important guests in quiet corners where sensitive conversations could be conducted without interruption. Hoffa had chosen the location himself, believing it demonstrated his continued influence and connections. Hoffa arrived at the Red Fox around 2 p.m., driving his own car, a green 1974 Pontiac Granville. He parked in a restaurant's parking lot and went inside, expecting to find Giacalone and Provenzano waiting for him. Instead, he was told that no one had made a reservation under those names, and no one matching their descriptions had arrived. This should have been a warning sign. In the world of organized crime and high-stakes business negotiations, punctuality was not just courtesy. It was a sign of respect and seriousness. The fact that both men were late to such a crucial meeting should have triggered Hoffa's well-developed survival instincts. Instead, Hoffa decided to wait. Witnesses later reported seeing him in the restaurant's bar area, checking his watch frequently and appearing increasingly agitated as the minutes ticked by. He made several phone calls from the restaurant's payphone, trying to locate the missing participants. At approximately 2:30 p.m., Hoffa called his wife from the restaurant. "The bastards haven't showed up," he told Josephine, his frustration evident even over the phone. "I'm going to wait a few more minutes, but if they don't get here soon, I'm coming home." It was the last time anyone who loved Jimmy Hoffa would ever hear his voice. Around 2:45 p.m., Hoffa gave up waiting inside the restaurant and walked out to the parking lot. Multiple witnesses saw him, standing near his Pontiac, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. He appeared to be talking to someone, though descriptions of who varied significantly. Some witnesses reported seeing him approach a car with several occupants, while others claimed he was met by men who seemed to know him well. What happened next has been the subject of nearly 5 decades of investigation, speculation, and debate. What is certain is that sometime between 2:45 p.m. and 3:30 p.m. on July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa vanished completely. His car was found later that evening in the Red Fox parking lot, keys still in the ignition, wallet, and personal effects undisturbed. When Hoffa failed to return home for dinner as promised, Josephine knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. Her husband was obsessively punctual and would never miss a family meal without calling. By 8 p.m., she had contacted the Oakland County Sheriff's Department to report her husband missing. The initial police response was cautious. Hoffa's reputation as a controversial figure with dangerous enemies meant that his disappearance could represent anything from a voluntary absence to avoid legal troubles, to kidnapping, to murder. But as hours turned to days with no contact, no ransom demands, and no sightings, it became clear that something sinister had occurred. The FBI was brought in within 48 hours, launching what would become one of the most extensive and expensive investigations in the Bureau's history. Agents interviewed hundreds of witnesses, executed dozens of search warrants, and began the painstaking process of mapping Hoffa's movements, relationships, and potential enemies. The Red Fox parking lot became a crime scene, though no physical evidence of violence was found. Hoffa's Pontiac was processed for fingerprints, blood evidence, and any signs of struggle, but the car revealed nothing. It was as if Jimmy Hoffa had simply walked out of the restaurant and vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions that would haunt investigators for the next half-century. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa unleashed an investigative frenzy that would consume the FBI for decades and capture the American public's imagination like few cases in history. Within weeks of his vanishing, the investigation had grown from a missing person case into a massive federal operation involving hundreds of agents, multiple task forces, and resources that would eventually cost taxpayers tens of millions of dollars. The FBI's initial focus centered on the 3 men who were supposed to meet Hoffa that day. Anthony "Tony" Jack. Giacalone was a powerful Detroit mafia captain who controlled gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering operations throughout the Midwest. Anthony "Tony" Provenzano was a former Teamsters official from New Jersey with deep connections to the Genovese crime family. Both men had solid alibis for July 30th, 1975, alibis that seemed almost too convenient to be coincidental. Giacalone claimed he was getting a massage at a health club the time of Hoffa's disappearance, with multiple witnesses to corroborate his story. Provenzano insisted he was playing cards with friends in New Jersey, nearly 600 miles away from the Red Fox restaurant. These alibis were professionally constructed, the kind of ironclad defenses that experienced criminals establish before committing major crimes. The third key suspect emerged as the investigation deepened. Frank the Irishman Sheeran, a Teamsters official and alleged hitman who had served as Hoffa's bodyguard and enforcer for years. Sheeran had a complex relationship with Hoffa, part loyalty, part fear, part mutual dependence. He understood better than anyone how Hoffa's mind worked and what it would take to lure him to his death. As the months turned to years without a breakthrough, the Hoffa case began generating a cottage industry of theories, confessions, and supposed revelations. Mafia informants, seeking reduced sentences or witness protection, began claiming knowledge of Hoffa's fate. Each news story sent FBI agents on expensive wild goose chases across the country. One of the most persistent theories involved the New Jersey landfills, where multiple informants claim Hoffa's body had been buried under tons of garbage and construction debris. The FBI conducted numerous excavations at sites across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and heavy machinery to search for any trace of remains. Each dig cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and produced nothing but disappointment. Another popular theory suggested that Hoffa had been cremated immediately after his murder, his body disposed of in one of the many industrial furnaces controlled by organized crime families. This theory was particularly frustrating for investigators because it was virtually impossible to disprove. If true, there would be no physical evidence left to find. The most sensational theory involved the construction of Giant Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey. According to this legend, Hoffa's body was buried in concrete beneath the stadium's foundation during construction in the mid-1970s. The story captured public imagination and became a running joke in popular culture. But extensive testing during the stadium's demolition in 2010 found no evidence to support the claim. In 1982, 7 years after his disappearance, Jimmy Hoffa was declared legally dead. The declaration provided some closure for his family, but did nothing to satisfy public curiosity or end the FBI's investigation. If anything, the official acknowledgement of Hoffa's death seemed to intensify public fascination with the mystery. The case took a dramatic turn in 2004 with the publication of I Heard You Paint Houses by Charles Brandt. The book featured deathbed confessions from Frank Sheeran, who claimed to be Hoffa's actual killer. According to Sheeran's account, he had lured Hoffa to a house in Detroit under the pretense of brokering peace with his enemies. Once inside, Sheeran claimed he shot Hoffa twice in the back of the head, then helped dispose of the body at a crematorium owned by organized crime figures. Sheeran's confession was compelling because of his intimate knowledge of Hoffa's habits, relationships, and psychology. He provided details that seemed to corroborate the known timeline and explained how the murder had been orchestrated by Pennsylvania crime boss Russell Bufalino, who wanted to eliminate Hoffa as a threat to profitable arrangements with the Teamsters pension fund. The confession gained even more attention when director Martin Scorsese adapted it into the 2019 film The Irishman, starring Robert De Niro as Sheeran and Al Pacino as Hoffa. However, law enforcement experts remain skeptical of Sheeran's claims, noting inconsistencies in his story and the lack of corroborating physical evidence. Between 1975 and 2020, the FBI investigated over 300 tips related to Hoffa's disappearance. They conducted searches in farms, landfills, concrete structures, lakes, and abandoned buildings across dozens of states. Each investigation cost significant resources and raised hopes that the mystery might finally be solved, only to end in frustration and dead ends. The case became a symbol of how organized crime could make someone disappear so completely that even the full resources of federal law enforcement couldn't find a trace. It demonstrated the sophisticated planning and execution capabilities of professional criminals and highlighted the challenges faced by investigators working against subjects who understood how to manipulate the system. Despite decades of investigation and countless theories, 3 fundamental questions remained unanswered. Who killed Jimmy Hoffa? How was his body disposed of? And why had no credible physical evidence ever been discovered? After nearly 5 decades of fruitless investigations, false leads, and crushing disappointments, the Jimmy Hoffa case took an unexpected turn in late 2021 when the FBI received what agents described as their most credible tip in decades. The information came from an unlikely source: the deathbed confession of a former New Jersey waste management executive who claimed to have intimate knowledge of Hoffa's final resting place. The informant, whose identity remains sealed in federal court documents, had worked for decades in New Jersey's notoriously mob-connected waste disposal industry during the 1970s and 1980s. According to FBI sources, this individual had maintained a silence for over 40 years out of fear for his family's safety, but terminal cancer had convinced him to finally reveal what he knew about one of America's most enduring mysteries. The tip led federal investigators to a 30-acre abandoned industrial site in Hackensack, New Jersey, approximately 15 miles from New York City. The location was particularly intriguing to investigators because it had been owned during the 1970s by a waste management company with documented connections to the Genovese crime family, the same organization that had employed Anthony Provenzano, one of the original suspects in Hoffa's disappearance. What made this tip different from the hundreds of others the FBI had investigated over the decades was the specificity of the information provided. The informant didn't just claim to know where Hoffa was buried. He provided detailed descriptions of the burial site, the method of disposal, and the identities of several individuals who had allegedly participated in the cover-up. Most significantly, he provided information that investigators could independently verify through historical records and satellite imagery. In March 2022, the FBI launched what they called Operation Final Answer, deploying some of the most advanced investigative technology available to modern law enforcement. The initial phase involved comprehensive geological surveys using ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and soil analysis techniques that were far more sophisticated than anything available during the 1970s investigations. The results were immediately promising. Radar scans revealed several anomalies in the subsurface soil patterns, including what appeared to be a deliberately excavated and backfilled area roughly 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 6 feet deep, dimensions that could accommodate a human body. Even more intriguing, soil samples from this area showed chemical compositions inconsistent with the surrounding earth, suggesting the presence of materials that didn't belong in the natural environment. The excavation phase began in June 2022 with a full forensic archaeology team working under FBI supervision. Using techniques typically employed at historical dig sites, investigators carefully removed layers of soil while documenting and preserving every artifact discovered. The process was painstakingly slow but methodical, designed to ensure that any evidence found would be admissible in court and scientifically verifiable. At a depth of approximately 5 feet, excavators made their first significant discovery: fragments of what appeared to be a concrete burial vault or container that had been deliberately crushed and scattered. Chemical analysis revealed traces of quicklime, a substance commonly used in the 1970s to accelerate decomposition and eliminate odors from buried remains. The presence of quicklime was particularly significant because multiple FBI informants over the years had mentioned its use in organized crime body disposal methods. More disturbing discoveries followed. Mixed in with the concrete fragments were pieces of fabric that preliminary analysis suggested came from a business suit manufactured in the mid-1970s. Forensic textile experts identified the material as wool blend consistent with expensive menswear of the era, exactly the type of clothing Hoffa was known to favor and was wearing on the day he disappeared. The most significant breakthrough came on July 15, 2022, almost exactly 47 years after Hoffa's disappearance. Deep within the excavated area, investigators discovered what appeared to be human bone fragments. The remains were immediately transported to the FBI's state-of-the-art forensic laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, where a team of specialists began the complex process of identification and analysis. Initial examinations were promising but inconclusive. The bone fragments were consistent with a male individual of Hoffa's approximate age and physical build, but decades in the ground had severely degraded the remains. Traditional identification methods like dental records were impossible because no intact teeth had been recovered. However, advances in DNA technology offered new possibilities that hadn't existed during the early years of the investigation. The DNA analysis process proved extraordinarily challenging. Environmental factors, chemical contamination from the quicklime, and the advanced age of the remains had degraded most genetic material beyond recognition. However, using cutting-edge mitochondrial DNA techniques, forensic scientists were able to extract partial genetic profiles from several bone fragments. The breakthrough came when investigators compared these genetic profiles to DNA samples voluntarily provided by Hoffa's surviving family members. In October 2022, the FBI announced that preliminary DNA analysis had identified what they termed significant genetic markers consistent with familial relationship to Jimmy Hoffa. While not definitive enough to constitute legal proof, the results represented the strongest scientific evidence ever discovered in the case. Concurrent with the DNA analysis, investigators were working to build a comprehensive picture of how Hoffa's alleged murder and burial had been orchestrated. Documents seized from the waste management company revealed a complex web of relationships between legitimate businesses and organized crime figures. Financial records showed suspicious payments made during the summer of 1975 to contractors who specialized in concrete work and heavy equipment operation. Perhaps most significantly, investigators discovered that the burial site had been carefully chosen for its isolation and security. The industrial facility had been closed to public access, surrounded by high fences and monitored by security guards who were reportedly on the payroll of organized crime figures. The location provided perfect cover for the type of operation required to dispose of a body permanently and secretly. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated planning that had gone into Hoffa's disappearance. Phone records from 1975, recently digitized and analyzed using modern data mining techniques, showed a pattern of communications between key suspects in the days leading up to July 30th. These communications suggested that Hoffa's fate had been decided weeks before the meeting at the Red Fox restaurant, and that the supposed peace negotiation was actually an elaborate ruse designed to lure him to his death. As of early 2025, the FBI considers the physical investigation largely complete, but the legal implications continue to unfold. Most of the original suspects in Hoffa's murder are now deceased, eliminating the possibility of criminal prosecution. However, the discovery has provided unprecedented insight into the methods and motivations behind one of organized crime's most successful operations. The case has also had profound implications for law enforcement's understanding of how sophisticated criminal organizations operate. The level of planning, coordination, and resource allocation required to make Jimmy Hoffa disappear so completely demonstrated capabilities that exceeded what investigators had previously attributed to organized crime groups. For Hoffa's surviving family members, the discovery has brought a measure of closure after nearly 5 decades of uncertainty. His daughter Barbara Cranesor told reporters that while the pain of loss never diminished, finally knowing her father's fate allowed the family to begin a new chapter of grieving and remembrance. The broader cultural impact of solving the Hoffa mystery cannot be overstated. For generations of Americans, the question, "What happened to Jimmy Hoffa?" had become a cultural touchstone, referenced in countless movies, television shows, books, and comedy routines. The case represented the ultimate unsolved mystery, a symbol of how even the most powerful law enforcement agencies could be stymied by sophisticated criminal planning. Yet the resolution of the case has also raised troubling questions about the extent of organized crime's influence in American society during the 1970s and beyond. The level of corruption and cooperation required to successfully eliminate such a high-profile figure suggests that criminal organizations had infiltrated legitimate institutions far more extensively than previously understood. The Hoffa case ultimately serves as a reminder of the complex relationship between power, corruption, and justice in American society. Jimmy Hoffa built his career by walking the fine line between legitimate labor advocacy and criminal enterprise, using whatever methods necessary to protect and advance the interests of his members. In the end, those same methods and relationships became the instruments of his destruction. His legacy remains as complex and contradictory as the man himself. To many working Americans, especially those in the transportation industry, Hoffa remains a hero who fought against corporate exploitation and secured better wages, benefits, and working conditions for millions of people. To law enforcement and government officials, he represented the dangerous corruption of democratic institutions by organized crime. The discovery of his remains has not resolved these contradictions, but it has provided definitive answers to the questions that have haunted American law enforcement for nearly half a century. Jimmy Hoffa's story is finally complete, a tale of ambition, power, betrayal, and ultimate justice that reflects both the promise and the peril of the American dream. In death, as in life, Jimmy Hoffa continues to fascinate and divide public opinion. But now, at least his family knows where he rests, and the FBI can finally close the book on one of the most expensive and extensive investigations in the Bureau's history. The mystery that captivated America for 5 decades has been solved, but the questions it raises about power, corruption, and justice will continue to resonate for generations to come.